Hi, can you hear me? Hi. Good morning. I'm Katja from University. This is a project that I'm going to tell you about where we looked at the effects of audio on play experiences in virtual reality. This was conducted as a collaborative project with the University of Waterloo with the HSL Games Group. Some of them are in the audience right now. Alright, so let's have a look. We have VR. VR is getting very, very important right now. It's been getting a lot of interest in both inside of academia and outside of it, and there's a lot of research and development that's going on here because it's just gotten to the point where we can actually do quite a lot of things with it. And a lot of research is pointed towards all these benefits or potential benefits in terms of educational applications and therapeutic benefits that we can maybe get from these things. And the main consensus seems to be that, oh, VR is so immersive, so that's why we want to do all these things with it. But we don't actually know fully what facilitates this immersive experience. And I'd like to point to one factor that, in my opinion, is actually underrepresented in games research in general, so we should all be doing more audio research, I think. And in terms of VR, audio is even less represented, just because it's like a burgeoning new field. So let's have a quick look at the literature on audio games in general. What we know about it is that it's very important for user feedback, it's important for user engagement. It can enhance the realism of a game or any kind of virtual experience by hiding the medium, so to speak. At least that's the theory behind it. And it can increase immersion, it can induce and strengthen emotional reactions in games particularly, but yeah, in any kind of experience. And it is important for storytelling, which is also important for games. It is important for game perception. And there's even been a meta-analysis of the effect of audio on presence, which was done by Cummings and Billingson in 2016, where they looked at 115 effect sizes across different studies and found that sound quality actually has a larger effect on presence than visual quality. So it's really, really interesting and important, but we don't quite fully understand it. And if we look at the role of audio in VR, we know very, very little. So what I found was one clue from like ages ago, very, very early stage VR, where they looked at a virtual environment, which of course back then looked a little bit different than it does now. And they found that ambient noises and sound effects in this virtual environment were able to increase immersion, unlike adding visual detail, which did not improve immersion actually in their study. Now, of course, this is from 1999, so now we have HMDs from like Oculus and the Vive headset and all that kind of thing, but we don't actually know how this actually might change things. There are two studies that I want to point out to that are a little bit more modern. One of them is by Lynn from 2017, where they looked at a horror game in VR and looked at different fear reactions in that horror game. And 70% of these fear reactions were actually attributed to the sound effects that accompanied the game events, so like startling effects and some like static noises or auditory hallucinations, that kind of thing. And then I want to point to a study by Tan et al., which was published in 2015 at Kai-Play, I believe. They compared a VR game and a monitor display version of that same game, and they found, in a side note, they also mentioned that players found that in-game events sounded more immersive in VR, but audio was not their focus. I do recommend that you read their paper, but it's not the focus of the study. It was just like a minor mention. So this is like the point where I was like, well, let's have a look at audio in virtual reality. And so the key research question driving this project was whether or not audio plays a key role in the multisensory immersive VR experience. So we decided to run a couple studies to find out what actually is going on with audio in VR. The first question that we actually wanted to look at was how does VR affect the play experience, and particularly the audio perception, in comparison to a monitor display. So we compared HMD VR to just sitting on a computer and watching it through a monitor display. And the second study that we did is about the effect of audio dimensionality on player experience in VR. And by audio dimensionality, the word dimensionality in this context is used for several different things. In this case, what I mean is a different number of audio types. So if you have potentially barely any audio at all, if you have only ambient noises and like environmental sounds, or if you have actually background music as well, and or actually people talking to you in terms of narration. Alright, so let's have a look at the studies. The stimuli that we used for this study was the Vanishing of Ethan Carter. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's a horror adventure game, it's classified as. We used the first 10 minutes of this game. And the reasons why. So first off, we needed a game that was available in both VR and PC versions, and there aren't that many of those yet, although it's getting a lot better. And it also has very, very good audio. It's won multiple awards and it has a lot of accolades, and it's actually very well known for having a very immersive and atmospheric sound design. And also has multiple types of audio, so even in the first 10 minutes, which we use as our stimuli, it already shows, it uses narration, ambient noises, background music, and sound effects. And it actually allows you to toggle these individual audio types on and off, which is also a very useful feature if you're doing a study like this. Beyond that, it also has a very good narrative arc. It takes people a little bit by the hand, so it's a very, very good game for beginner players, which we kind of were hoping for because we wanted to look at the effect of audio and not have too many confounding factors of game literacy in there. All right, so that's why we used this game for our studies. So we had people play this game in 2 different versions. The game is played by a gamepad controller, and in one version we had people play the game in front of a monitor display, and in one version we had them play it in the Vive headset. All right, so let's look at the first study that we did. The first study was a mixed method study, mainly qualitative though. We began with consent and demographics and gave people an introduction to the game and the controls of the game with 12 participants. And then we let them play the game for 10 minutes, after which we gave them their experience surveys, namely the game engagement questionnaire, the PANAS, which is the positive affect, negative affect scale, and the immersive experience questionnaire. And we did this once for the HMD VR version of the game and once for the monitor display version of the game, and then made them switch in kind of balanced order around the study. And then after all this, we did a semi-structured interview with them to see how they experienced individual audio types and how they experienced gameplay in combination with all these audio types. All right, so let's have a look at the quantitative stuff first. We were actually very surprised to find that the quantitative results, and we used the game engagement, the PANAS, and the IAQ, they actually didn't really differ much in terms of whether you played with the monitor version or the VR version. There was a significant negative correlation of game engagement with prior VR experience, of which there weren't that many. Should be mentioned, they were mostly novices to VR. But overall, we only really found one difference, which is in 2 factors of the IAQ, so the immersive experience questionnaire. And we found that the PC version had people felt a significantly higher challenge level, and in the VR version, people felt a significantly higher emotional involvement, which wasn't really something we were expecting. And this actually didn't correlate with prior VR experience. So this kind of stumped us a little bit, but then if you look at the qualitative results, it actually becomes a bit more clear. So one of the things that we found, and I'm not going to go into all of the stuff of the qualitative stuff that we found. I do recommend that you perhaps have a look at the paper if you're interested in that. But one of the things I do want to talk about is the difference in gameplay absorption that players felt. So in the VR version, players had a much greater focus on the visuals, on the sensory experience, and on exploration. So here's a quote by one participant. They were much more focused on their senses experience, on their whole body experience, looking at the sky and seeing that the wind was blowing around them. So the game is very, very well crafted. There are a lot of little details, and players were kind of distracted by the entire atmosphere, by the visuals, the senses, by everything. Now, if you compare that to the monitor display version, in this version of the game, people were much more focused on gameplay progress. So finding clues, progressing in the game. The game is a horror adventure game, and you eventually, you wander around, you stumble upon a corpse, and you're supposed to figure out what happened. So they were much more focused on this discovery quest of the actual gameplay story in this version than they were in VR. So they were more immersed in playing the game and getting it done and the puzzles. All right, so this was a significant difference for sure. And it explains a little bit why perhaps the challenge was greater in the PC version. Okay, so another thing that we found that was also quite interesting is that the function of audio types was perceived very, very differently. So generally people thought that either background music or ambient noises were most important, but the people seemed fairly split on which one was more important to them. So the background music for some people was so dramatic that if they came in a direction the background music sounded creepy, they would go elsewhere because it was like, oh, that might be a scary place, I don't want to go there. And other people found the ambient noises particularly important because for them it helped to make the whole thing more realistic and was really important for them. Half of the participants, though, didn't even notice that there was any background music. And when we asked them about it, they were like, "That was background music?" So it's a very, very subjective thing, and that can also potentially explain why the quantitative stuff, the quantitative measures, had difficulty picking up any differences because it's just so very, very different for people, for individuals. All right. And there was a very, very different perception of the audio in terms of that in VR, audio seemed to shift into the background, which we found out from the qualitative stuff. In terms of that, a lot of people mentioned that the background music was more triggering and affected people more in the PC game. So there is a very distinct difference that we hadn't necessarily expected here. So based on this, it seems like audio in VR perhaps isn't as important as it might be on the PC. So to follow up that study, we ran a second one, where we wanted to look at the effects of sensory richness, and so in terms of audio types. If we add on more audio types, does that have an effect? Or in this case, we removed different audio types to see what happened then. And sensory richness has been shown to increase presence in virtual bright environments, so we're thinking that with more auditory types, you should also have more presence, which is also linked to things like immersion and engagement and enjoyment and all these kinds of things. So we ran a second study on audio dimensions in VR. We recruited 40 participants and ran a quantitative study. We had people play the game for 10 minutes again, and this time only in VR. But this time we had them play either the full game version, where you had all 4 auditory types, or they played a version without background music, or a version without ambient noises, or they had neither background music or ambient noises, but instead they had only the basics, voice and sound effects, which we, based on like having people play it, it kind of is necessary to have those two as like basic user feedback. And then we had them fill out various PX questionnaires, play experience questionnaires, such as the game engagement questionnaire and the PANAS and IQ, which we already used previously. Because the PANAS questionnaire we found didn't really work that well in the first study, we used the SAM as well, which is the self-assessment mannequin. So it also assesses emotional state, but it doesn't use quite as extreme adjectives as the PANAS does. So for a game like this, I feel like this is perhaps a better measure. And we also added the player identification scale to see if it actually had an effect on how the player identified with themselves, because if they're walking around, there's some theory in sound literature that if you're walking around and you hear the grass that you're walking on, this could also have an effect on identification with that character. But there was no difference in player experience, it turns out. This is just the graph of the IAQ, but it just ran across all the measures that we had. People were similarly engaged, immersed, and experienced, regardless of how many audio types we gave them. So of course we only gave them up to the minimum of having basic game user feedback with the narration and the sound effects, but adding on background music and ambient noises actually didn't make a difference in this VR game. So overall, we might have to say that the role of audio in VR is actually less pronounced than it is in PC games. There is a very strong difference in terms of whether or not a game is perceived as challenging or if a game is perceived as emotionally involving, depending on which game you're playing, which we think comes down to this difference in gameplay and absorption in terms of the focus on exploration or gameplay progression. And we also think that audio types are highly, highly subjective. So while there was no difference in terms of player experience for these, for the second study in VR, since so many players actually didn't notice the background music, but others found it so impressive that they actually moved in a different direction, it might be worth doing a second study where we find people who are explicitly focused on this background music and perhaps see if there's a potential for customization there. And I'd like to still point out that game intrinsic feedback, like giving people enough audio to actually know what they're doing and having some kind of feedback that they're going the right way and like sound effects and that kind of thing, is still crucial. Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't have this in VR. So now I'd like to just touch on some guidelines for game and research design that we pulled from these two studies. I'm going to focus on 2 of them. The first of which is perhaps we should be limiting audio dimensions in VR games, so giving them what they need for VR for basic feedback, but beyond that, perhaps we don't need to add that much background music. It might not actually make much of a difference, especially if we're focusing on the stuff that we measured here as dependent variables. And of course, I do want to mention that these are mostly VR novices, and it's quite possible that motion sickness also has an effect on this, and it's perhaps a distraction factor. And I do talk about this a lot in the paper, and I welcome you to read that there. But people are going to be novices in VR for quite some time, so this is something that we need to deal with as researchers and developers, because it's just the state of the world right now. And the second thing I want to talk about is, I think we really need to be designing for exploration in VR gameplay. People were not focusing on the gameplay as much. So game design needs to be able to accommodate players in this and let them have their moments of reflection, of wonder, of looking around, seeing the wind, hearing the birds, and letting them do that before moving on to gameplay if they want to do so. The other things that we discuss in the paper are mainly that you should avoid forced camera movements, which happened in the game quite a bit in the first 10 minutes, and then also that if you're using gamepad-based VR navigation, it should definitely not have very long gameplay sessions, because otherwise it really can lead to quite a bit of simulated sickness. And finally, also, of course, which I already touched upon, we really do need to accommodate for novelty bias in these games, because it's going to be around for quite a while. So this is the summary of our guidelines for game and research design. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you very much. And the microphone is open for questions.
Hi, it's really interesting. I wonder, aside from nausea, what impact playing with a gamepad might have, because I ran a study recently which compared VR and TV using a gamepad, and had similar comparative experiences, and partly people said, because when they're in VR they're still playing with a gamepad, they still know they're playing a game, and so the Cummings paper showed that interactional realism increases presence too, so I wonder, the more present they feel, the less gamey it feels. Could that then change their immersion and the relevance of...
I do think it's quite possible. It's kind of hard to say that though without running the study again with a different version. And so this game was only playable with gamepad controllers, so it kind of limited us in that regard. But I absolutely do think that's quite a possibility, yeah. But then again, I do think that if you give this game to players that are very comfortable with gamepad controllers, then this effect won't be there as much. And a lot of the players actually were. So we did accommodate for novices and not having that great of a game literacy, but we did have quite a few participants as well who were very comfortable with the gamepad and were just playing around with it, and even used controls that we didn't actually. So we gave them a very limited set of the controls, just this is how you move forward, this is how you control the camera. But they were starting to do sprint and stuff like that we hadn't told them about, and a couple of them were just going off and doing that on their own. So yeah, we definitely have to run a second study to figure out how much that affects it.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation, really interesting. I'm interested in augmented audio applications in real world settings, and my current work is studying that type of, those types of interactions. I'm curious as to, your study looks at very sort of like a holistic aspect of the gameplay. I'm wondering if you studied or if you plan to look at perception of specific objects and how they might be enhanced by using audio or not, and that sort of interplay.
I actually haven't looked at that at all yet. I do think it's very, very interesting. So do you mean different objects in terms of if it's a moving object, or it's an object that emanates sound, or is
no, just like a virtual object that's placed in your space or in your field of view, and how audio might enhance or kind of enrich the perception or the sense of that object.
No, I haven't looked at that, but I think that's really interesting.
Okay.
If you plan to do that, I would be interested in hearing about it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hi, David Flama, University of Guelph. I don't go to many games talks, so I'm completely clueless. But I'm a bit terrified at the suggestion of kind of limiting audio things, just because they look like there's no spatial audio in the game.
Yeah.
And so in VR, that's going to have quite a substantial effect. And you have headphones in both conditions, which is great. So, but spatial audio can have a lot of value.
Yes.
But also, this is one kind of sample on the whole, how much audio matters in a game. And so if you had an audio-only game, no visuals at all.
That would definitely change
I
things.
think, right. So
Yeah.
there's a giant scale here of how important audio is in a game, and so if that game happened to be where the audio isn't very important, I don't know, I don't play any games, but right then maybe we need to sample that whole spectrum to see just really where audio really counts, really matters.
I want to add two things to that. So
Okay,
if
that's
it's
not my
like
question, but yeah, sorry,
Oh.
forget it. No, go ahead.
So if it's like a game where you only have audio, then the audio becomes your main user feedback, right? And we do not want to limit that at all. Like that's really, really crucial for sure. This is just about anything beyond that.
Right.
So, and then the second thing I wanted to mention is the spatial audio thing. I do absolutely believe that will change things, yes, but we're talking about this kind of game setting, and that right now people are playing with these games in this context. They're not
As they are,
using
yeah.
like binaural, super realistic audio just because they just don't have access to it, and it's easy to just like start playing, have your audio headphones, and that's how people are playing right now. So for this context, I don't mean for like if you had like a spatially binaural, like super realistic setting, and people are working on this, right? I think it would be super interesting to run the study again in this context.
And just my final thing would
Yeah.
make sure to measure people's hearing ability.
Yes.
Because hearing loss is really, really common and really, really subtle. People don't know about it, but it's going to affect results like this. So,
That's a good
yeah,
point.
especially spatial audio. Especially spatial audio. Yeah. So thanks.
Thank you.
Let's thank Katja again. So I'm standing up here